everybody. Welcome to the 10K podcast. Today, Justin Gohn from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, home of the cheesesteak, Rocky Balboa, the Joan. I'm excited to have Justin on. I find him to be very exciting and refreshing in the appraisal space. I like to look at his posts. He makes appraising fun. He seems to be one of the active thought leaders that really listens. Today, I want to get on what he sees for the appraisal profession currently and what state it's in and what he anticipates and sees. I know recently he's been on a lot of different podcasts, being recognized as a thought leader. He's big in the Philadelphia market space. And today we're going to get into a couple of things. First and foremost, I want to get a recommendation on the best cheesesteak in Philly. There's always a lot of debate about who's got that when I get up that way. One of my favorites is Larry's. So I'll just get his opinion on that. And with no further ado, yeah, Philadelphia.
Hey, what's going on? So, Thaddeus, you were talking about all the good things in Philly. You did mention, maybe I just missed it, Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. Did you include that?
I did miss that. So, yeah, congratulations. I really like what you all are doing up there. But just like anything else, when people start to win and have some success, those that aren't as successful want to raise the bar. And I was reading where they wanted to eliminate the tush push because it seemed like y'all got a lot of ass up there in Philly pushing across the line.
Yeah, well, I guess if you can't beat them, try to legislate them away. We'll see what happens there. I think it's going to be tough to make that rule, but who knows? We'll see.
But the other thing, and since we're talking about sports, and you brought up Philly, I didn't want to bring up the process. So where are we at with the process? I mean, we have been waiting for 10 years for the process to matriculate at this point.
Yeah, it's just now. Listen, it's just never going to happen. That's where we are in the process. I just don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. But I will answer your question though. So with the cheesesteak thing, everybody's got their own thing. You can go with Geno's and Pat's is obviously the most famous in South Philadelphia. They're right across, they're right at the same intersection, facing each other. Actually, out in the suburbs in Delaware County, there's Delco's Original. I'll put them up against anybody. They're less than 5 minutes.
Write that down. Delco's Original.
Yeah, Delco's Original. So they're like 2 or 3 minutes from my house. So if you stop into Delco's, make sure you shoot me a text. I'll come over there and I'll buy you one. They don't take a back seat to anybody. So
Delco's, okay. Usually I'm staying downtown. My wife lived in Delaware for 20 years. To go visit her, I used to fly into Philadelphia all the time. And my favorite shoe store is there, downtown, Blue Soul Shoes.
Okay.
I don't know if they're still there. I was there a couple of years ago, and they were there. I was there for HBCU week at the White House last year, I believe.
Okay.
So
very cool. Yeah, it's a great town. There's some really good areas. There's some areas maybe you want to steer clear of a little bit, but that's sort of that's sort of how it goes no matter where you're at. But a lot of culture in the city. Obviously a rich history. Sports, art, culture, and all that. So next time you're in town, we definitely have to get together. Be my treat wherever you want to get.
I'll definitely reach out to you. So you're at the Philadelphia chapter of the Appraisal Institute. And one of the things that really had caught my attention several months ago when you and I started communicating was that the Institute was missing the boat on its local chapters. And you felt like there should be some investment from local chapters in order to move the industry forward, which really resonated with me. And then that's when you and I started communicating, because I do believe that the profession has evolved. However, the culture has not evolved and been able to keep up.
Yeah, so I will say, Thaddeus, you're going in and out a lot. So, but I think I got the gist of your question. I'm just letting you know. I'm not sure if there's some gremlins in your computer over there or not.
Yeah,
But
I got to figure out what's going on here.
so, but I'll answer your question. I got a sense of what you were saying. Yeah, so this year in 2025, I'm fortunate enough to be serving as the president of the Philly Metro chapter. And then last year, I guess it would have been about November or December, I just had this idea of getting all the chapter presidents together, which had never been done before, which I called the 2025 Chapter Presidents Virtual Summit. And, there were other people, it wasn't just me. I mean, I reached out to a couple of people and I said, hey, you think this would be a good idea? And, there were several people who got on board early and, were sort of champions of the idea. So, all the chapter presidents got together. And I think it was worthwhile. There's 62 or 63 chapter presidents of all the different chapters across the country, and I think 55 or 56 showed up for the virtual summit. So that was a really good turnout. All of them said they got value out of it. So I think just being able to have that type of communication among all the different people that are leading the chapters was an important thing to do. Now, you mentioned, I think you sort of set the question up in the with the sense of, well, is there something wrong with the institute, and was this trying to address it? I'm not sure. Listen, the more I think about our profession and the Appraisal Institute, I come away with having more questions than answers. Really, I would say that, and not to overwhelm anybody here with a big long list, but as I think about the Appraisal Institute more and more, there's several issues that I think are very important. And right now, I think there's 6 of them, right? And the Chapter President's Virtual Summit sort of brushes by and touches one of those. So I think the first, and these aren't ranked in order, but I think one of the first issues that requires thought, at least in discussion, is the idea of board size. We have a very large board size on the National Board of Directors. And, I sort of forget now exactly how many it is. So you'll have to forgive me for that. But basically, every region, as I understand it, and I'm learning more about sort of the power structure, will have 2 representatives that are on the board, and then there's the executive committee as well. So you end up having, and again, I had this written down, but it's just not in front of me. But you get to the situation where we have like 20 or 24 national board members. It's something like that roughly. So hopefully nobody will hold it against me too much. But it's a
I
large
think
board.
when you get a board that big, it makes things ineffective. And I've seen it where it just boils down to a couple of people controlling the power and making things move and making the needle move. I think that your idea with bringing all of the presidents together was something that's been very needed in the core competency or cultural competency or regional competency is more important. And I think that in that board structure that has given way to the national, where there's been a couple of people that have been leading, and everything today localized and decentralized due to technology to make things more relevant. I know you all for the longest didn't want to have online meetings. Now I see that they're doing more online meetings and more online coursework. There just seems to have been a deaf ear to the membership as far as transparency and being moving forward.
So listen, what I would say is this. So with the board side thing, where I think that can become an issue, and again, I'm not saying this as if I know for sure. This is an area where I have a lot of questions and still doing my own investigation, so I can really come to a conclusion. But there's a lot been written on this. One of the more famous people to write on this is Peter Thiel. In his book 0 to 1, when you have really large boards, what ends up happening is really it's one person, which Peter Thiel calls like a micro dictator. It's one person who's really in charge. and who's really driving the agenda. And I think there's evidence that historically that's been the case with the Appraisal Institute. You've moved through different epochs and different eras where that person's been different, but usually there's one driving force. And then what ends up happening when you have a large board is it sort of hides the fact that it's this one person driving all the decisions, because it gives this veneer and it gives this impression that, oh, it's all inclusive. Everybody's involved. We have this big board. So, these are decisions coming from a large consensus of people.
Stop you right there. I think you said a mouthful when you said veneer. Veneer, right, and the way you represented it reminds me of the appraisal industry as a whole. There's a veneer that we have public trust or we're doing what's best, but there's a few folks that are leading the charge. And I don't believe there's a lot of transparency or connectivity. I believe there's a lot of disconnect. And the fact that you have more questions than answers makes you like a unicorn as an appraiser, because appraisers typically got all the answers and don't really like to ask a lot of questions, but do a lot of dictation.
Yeah, well, listen, I try to fight against that because I think that's just, human nature. I fall into that trap where I feel like, I have all the answers and the thing that I'm thinking, it's got to be right, So I'm always trying to fight against that. But yeah, listen, the other things you're touching on, there's more to touch on there. But I would just say with the board size, what ends up happening is it gives the impression or this veneer that everybody's involved and everybody's driving the agenda forward, when really that's not happening. Usually it's one, again, to borrow the term from Peter Thiel, it's one micro dictator who's really driving the agenda. And if you have a smaller board where it's just only a handful of people, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, well, then all of a sudden people need to be accountable for the decisions that they're making, because you really can't hide behind this, gigantic board that gives the impression of inclusiveness. Listen, just to run through it real quick, I'll say, so that's one thing. There's a total of 6 things that are important. The other 5 are the voting process. So the way we go about voting for who will be our next president, that needs to be addressed. We can dig into that later if you want. This whole idea of, should we have a more federated model? So this is the more distributed model or decentralized model that you talked about. Right now at the Appraisal Institute, all the power is in the National Board of Directors. Full stop. And really with the executive committee. The other thing to talk about is the idea of, should we have open board meetings or not at the national level? Currently, we don't anymore. Again, that's a topic for discussion. I don't know if I have the right answer. The last 2 things are is PARIA a good idea or not? And then finally, and then finally, should the Appraisal Institute adopt a more aggressive legal posture? From the outside looking in, for me, because I haven't been on the national board, we haven't had what I would call an aggressive legal posture. Now, I could be wrong on this, but so I think that's something to talk about. So there's a lot there. Those are the 6 things that I'm thinking about that I don't have good answers to.
When you say aggressive legal posture, what is it that you need to be more aggressive legally about?
So here's an example. Right. So here's an example. So I read this white paper the other day because, Thaddeus, I'm, very interested in emerging technologies. I really enjoy learning about artificial intelligence. There's not a day that goes by that I'm not reading a white paper or watching an interview from a thought leader in the artificial intelligence world. So I read this white paper that said, there's going to become a point, whether that's 3 years, 5 years, even more, where AI models are going to be so good that they can just replace attorneys. Right? That you don't need, except for rare circumstances, you won't need a lawyer anymore because the AI models will be so good. But what the white paper said is that doesn't mean that lawyers are going to go away, because what will happen is the Bar Association and sort of the strength of the attorney lobby, so to speak, would fight back against that. So even if the technology was good enough to replace lawyers would file lawsuits. They'd say, no, you have to have a human lawyer involved. And if you don't have a lawyer involved, we're going to slam lawsuit after lawsuit right down your throat. You're not going to remove a human lawyer from the process. Now, that's exactly what's happening to real estate appraisers, from what I understand. Now, I'm not a residential appraiser. I do have my SRA, and I do handle some specialized residential appraisals. But from the feedback I hear from my residential brethren is that they're being taken out of the loop a lot by Fannie Mae, and there's higher thresholds now for appraiser waivers, right? For appraisal waivers. So the amount of residential appraisals that can be completed, from my understanding, is being whittled away at by regulation. Well, should the Appraisal Institute adopt the type of posture that you would see from the Bar Association if people tried to get rid of lawyers, which would result in aggressive lawsuits? So is that what the Appraisal Institute should be doing? Things like that on behalf of residential appraisers. Oh, you want to increase the threshold for appraisal waivers? We'll see you in court. You want to use more AVMs? We'll see you in court. Again, I don't know the answer to that, but you can passively deal with it by writing letters and expressing outrage, or you can say, we're going to sue you. And I'm not a legal scholar, but to me, it's a question that should be talked about as to whether or not we should do that. I don't know.
That's not the Appraisal Institute's job. I believe that it's the job of the federal government, and the institute has been a leader in the space, but it's been a very self-serving leader and hasn't been open to everybody. You've had probably one of the strongest lobbying, well, definitely in the appraisal field. But when they used to be a part of NAR, which is probably before you started appraising 30 years ago, when it was the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers, NAR had the biggest lobbying arm. I think now technology has definitely changed. I do believe appraisers have to be at the forefront of saving their profession. However, they've got everybody else at the forefront who wants to save the appraisal profession who aren't appraisers. I do not believe watering down the education is the answer. I do not believe. I believe in alternative pathways in order to get there. But just like manufacturing, the technology has changed and advanced, and appraisers have been slow to embrace the technology. And I think with the number of appraisers or lack thereof, the appraisers have become a friction point for the GSEs as far as processing and turning over the loans. The appraiser is the only group that has. So with these other AVMs, these other models, they don't have to follow USPAP. But I do believe that for appraisers, they just have to embrace the technology and enhance their skill set.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, yeah. Listen, I'm all on board of that. I mean, you just have to follow my LinkedIn feed for a day or two, and I'm a big fan of using whatever technology is available. Don't get stuck in the past and the old ways of doing things. But listen, when it comes to this whole idea of should the institute adopt a more aggressive legal posture, well, listen, you answered my question. Your point of view is no, it's not their job, and maybe that is the answer. Again, it's just I think there's worthy questions to ask and talk about. And if the way they've been approaching this stuff is appropriate, then I'm okay with that.
As a leading appraisal organization that everybody tends to follow, which I find hilarious because there's been so much chaos and confusion within the organization and trying to lead. And when you, like you said, with the model that currently exists, it's not effective. It needs to be updated. It's definitely not inclusive and welcoming. And that's where I tend to have an issue. And again, I think it gets back to the basic demographics. If you look at over 65% appraisers are over 50 and less than 7% are under 35. I believe the antiquated methodology with the older people charge and not wanting to relinquish control and keep control and power centralized. Again, that model that shares is more effective and it's more transparent. The meeting that you had with everybody online, there should be a decision that's made collectively, and there should be some transparency there should be transparency in the profession. There's so much secrecy and in the profession. I think it really just gets back to public trust. There's nobody advocating, in my opinion, for the public when it comes to fair and equitable valuations. But then there's been nobody that's been advocating for the appraisers. So the appraisers have really suffered, especially on the residential side, because it's so easy to be able to supplement with them. And you have the um, not appraisers, but underwriters, not even subject matter experts, to always be sides and review the appraiser to make revisions that may not necessarily be substantive, but they are more performative and they fit and check the box.
Oh well, yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure you see. Yeah, I think you probably see that in the commercial world as well. I'm sure appraisers would tell you that they've run into that sort of thing from from reviewers and underwriters. Listen, you touched on the chapter president's virtual summit that I put together. So that goes back to this whole idea again. Just another question. Right now, we definitely have a centralized top-down power structure. And to be fair, that is how most organizations are structured. Now, it doesn't make it right, but to me, it's worthwhile asking the question and exploring, well, is that how the Appraisal Institute should be structured? What I will say about a lot of real estate appraisers, at least that I know, and I've met more and more, especially over the last 3 or 4 years as I've been more involved in leadership. There's a lot of really good people out there, a lot that have become lifelong friends that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. What I will say, a lot of real estate appraisers are fiercely independent. That's sort of, and I get that impression from you. It's sort of like that's almost within the DNA of a real estate appraiser. So it would seem to me that a more federated or distributed power structure might fit better with the DNA of what an individual appraiser is, rather than having all the power in Chicago with the board of directors, have it more dispersed among the 63 different chapters. That's certainly not how it is now. Again, I don't know if that's the right way to go about it, but I do think it's worth talking about and debating and seeing, what the different stakeholders think.
I think you said a lot, and it is definitely worth talking about. And if you look at all of the other appraisal organizations combined and who's doing what and what's where in the space, I think the training is so important. So the AI is definitely going to be a part of that. But like you said, the decentralization is going to be imperative. And as I travel the country and far and wide, we are vastly independent. We are vastly isolated, which has allowed us to be picked off, for a better word, or co-opt. And there hasn't been any really strong on the behalf of the appraisers, and the ability to continue to close off access to the profession really changing the way that things are currently being structured with the GSEs, with the appraisal waivers. And I think there's going to be a boatload of business. I don't necessarily know that we will have all of the properties being taken back, but there is definitely a disconnect from things that have been appraised with an appraisal waiver, and now with the high level of liquidations or pre foreclosures that are being done. There is definitely a disparity and a gap between an automated valuation model and what an actual appraisal is, and being able to manage expectation, also being able to capture the velocity of change. And I don't think the AVMs always do such a good job of.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure they don't. I mean, AVMs. I think any sort of digital technology, even when you look at AI, as big of a fan of AI as I am, and I use it every day. It's integrated in what I do as a human now. It's good at some things, but then other things where you need an appraiser, or you just need a human in the loop. It doesn't matter what type of knowledge work that you're doing. What humans are good at and what AI models aren't, large language models, are sort of like what I call bottoms up thinking, abstract reasoning, sort of these higher cognitive tasks. What really is the highest and best use of this property? These comparable sales, maybe they look good. Are they really the most comparable sales? Are there any hidden risks in the system that, the data is telling me that, maybe an AI model or an ABM can't, extract out? So, yeah, I
What
mean,
do you find like the most helpful part of AI in your practice most?
So I think what AI is really good at, so the first thing it's really good at is taking information that is unstructured and then structuring it for you or organizing it for you. So, for commercial appraisers, that's things like abstracting a lease agreement. I mean, if you have a property where maybe you have 10, 15, 20 units, whether it's like multi-tenant office or like a shopping center, it can take a long time to read through a lot of detailed lease agreements and then create sort of like an organized lease abstract. Well, that becomes a trivial 1 or 2 minute task with AI. So what it's doing is it's taking unstructured information that's buried in a lease agreement and it's structuring it for you. So it's easy to understand. And there's a lot of permutations of that, parsing a zoning code, organizing a rent roll for you. Oftentimes we get rent rolls from property owners that are just a mess. And, to be able to, take that rent roll and put it in a format that we want, is now a trivial 30-second or 1 minute task. Other things that AI is good at is what I would call knowledge retrieval and knowledge synthesis. So, all appraisal firms, especially commercial appraisal firms, but residential appraisal firms too, but I guess they're dealing more with forms, but commercial appraisers, we primarily do narrative reports. It's all I do. And so we have big databases of all the appraisal reports we've ever completed. And then other things like market studies, you name it. We have these big databases. And right now, the way we search and retrieve information with databases is suboptimal. AI models are much better at doing that. There's frameworks where, for lack of a better term, you can take a powerful AI model, plug it into your own data, and then just have a conversation with it. You're just having a talk with your data. And the AI model, like I like to describe, it's like having an impossibly meticulous colleague who's read every appraisal and every document you've ever written and has perfect recall at any moment. So those are the things that AI is really good at. What it's not good at are creativity, those higher cognitive tasks. Listen, Thaddeus, you know as well as I do, the first step in the appraisal process, many would say, the appraisal of real estate 15th edition would say, is to identify the problem. That's a non-trivial task. Many junior appraisers who have been doing this 5, even 10 years have trouble correctly identifying the problem for a more complex for a more complex assignment. And there's no way an AI model is going to be able to do it. So, that's sort of like the barrier, I would say, between the human and the AI. The AI is good at the data grunt work. The human's good at the abstract thinking, the creativity, and the higher level planning.
One of the things that I kind of get tickled about that I've seen is there's been a lot of uproar about USPAP and AI and can you use an artificial appraisal? Should they have to be able to report it? If you think about once you get a template, I would say over 75% of the industry is just regurgitating something that was already produced anyway. So what is the difference between what's the big uproar with utilizing AI when basically we've been using an outdated form of AI since the beginning of time?
No, I think you make a great point there. I think that's an astute point. Listen, what I would say is this is, when the next use pack comes out, there's definitely going to be language in there about AI. And I think, listen, I think the people that are involved with that, I was on a webinar recently. I think they're going to be smart about it because I think what I saw is they're very thoughtful people asking the right questions. They're not going to come out with anything ridiculous and like say, oh, you can't use AI if you're a real estate appraiser. Like that would just be absurd. And the people that are going to be involved in making those decisions aren't going to do that. I know that. If they did, I would be shocked. But you bring up a good point. Listen, what I think we'll see is some very reasonable rules. So RICS just came out with their red book, and I was just interviewed about this by Altus Group. And what I think the
Can you explain to everybody what RICS and what the book is?
Yeah, so the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. I'm not a member there, but they have their red book, which again, I could get this a little bit wrong, but it's sort of like their use pattern.
International organization.
What's that?
Is that a national or international organization?
International. Yeah. So their red book's a lot like USPAT. It just lays out, excuse me, guidelines and standards that valuation professionals should follow. And the guidelines that came out just within the past couple months within the red book, excuse me, I need to get some water here. I'm all choked up. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, not a problem. I like the red book a little bit more just because the rest of the world doesn't utilize USPAT. So the red book is more for international standards, folks, a way to do valuation with different governments all around the world. And we are a little bit unique in the way that we manage risk, especially with the appraisal and the appraisal models that we utilize. It's vastly different from the European models and what they use for RICS and Red Book.
Yeah, so that's well said. So what came out in the Red Book, again, this is just the last several months when they updated the standards. They have language in there about AI. It's very reasonable. It's very well thought out. I would like to see USPAT just adopt this framework or maybe use it as a guide. And basically what they say, just like a high level view, is first of all, there's like language in there about, hey, if you're going to use an AI model, you should have a general idea of the capabilities and the limitation of the model that you're using, right? Just a general idea. Now, to me, that's very reasonable, right?
I think that's reasonable, but I still think at the end of the day, if you put your name on it, you're responsible for it. So ultimately, you're responsible for that model, and you get a lot of people that are outside. If you're violating USPAT, if you're doing something that's outside of your realm of expertise, then you need to either get some competency in that area. At the very least, you need to acknowledge, hey, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm utilizing AI in this particular report. And, just as a part of the disclaimer or disclosure statement, I believe. So that may cover it, may be a part of it. I don't know. Again, like you said, I think at this point, everything is open for discussion. And because the technology is changing each and every day, and there's so many different AI models. So some are better than others, and some of the open source I'm really excited about because that'll be able to keep the cost down and make it affordable for everybody. So a small office can act like a big office to be able to cover those different tasks that you talked about.
Yeah, so what I would say is just getting back to the Red Book for a second, they're right on board with you. So what I was going to say, so they have that general provision that you should have a general idea of what the model is that you're using, its limitations and capabilities. And then beyond that, just what you said is they explicitly say in there that if you get information from an AI model, for lack of a better word, you don't just copy and paste it and put it in your appraisal, right? Like that would be insane. They explicitly say you don't do that. What you need to do is if you get information from an AI model, you need to reason over it, synthesize it with your own judgment and your own understanding, right? And then incorporate it into your own thinking, into the appraisal. So to me, that's very reasonable and very common sense. The other thing that they say, and again, I think this is just work file 101, is they say that if you are using an AI model, and you can imagine you have this conversation where you have a prompt and a response and a prompt and a response, that you should save all of that in your work file. Now, you're not going to find me arguing with that. To me, that's work file retention 101. You should save that in your work file, and there are very easy ways to do that. So I don't know, man. I found the stuff that came out in the Red Book very reasonable. It's not limiting the use of AI. It's just saying, hey, keep a detailed work file. Don't just copy and paste information out of an AI model. That's the worst thing you can do.
Send me that link when you get a chance, Justin. I want to kind of see where it's going, but I'm sitting here thinking and laughing in my head, thinking about nobody reports anyway. So now, is somebody really going to read an appraisal report with all of this data in it, or are they going to feed the report into AI, and now AI is interpreting an AI-driven and written report?
Hey, you go out far enough, it could just be AI models talking to each other at that point.
I think that's where we're headed. Everybody wants to be efficient, and most times, most people, after the disclosure page and after the value, very few people are reading what's going on, unless maybe you got multiple leases. Somebody is possibly, they may take a look at the rent roll, but for the most part, folks are just glossing down to the
Well,
numbers.
you know what? There's so I had lunch last week with somebody who I have a great amount of respect for, who's been doing this for a long time, and also teaches on the college level. He's a MAI and has his CRE. And one of the things he talked about a lot with me, and I've heard this from other people, is the idea that, especially with commercial appraisal reports, that 99% of the time, the reports are just way longer than they have to be. And the people who are relying on them don't necessarily need all of that. Now, there's people who disagree with this, because I brought this up with some people, and they're like, no, it has to be 100, 150 pages long in order to comprehensively support what you're saying. I'm not so sure about that. I think that,
I'll jump in there and tell you that no, it's not. And I think that was from a time and place where people felt like they needed to do that to get paid by the page. Uh, Today, you can be more succinct and get to the point. And a lot of times, most of that, over 50% of those 100 pages are, if you're talking about historical data that's irrelevant, that people don't care about. So if you get back to report writing and synthesizing with the new use PAP and the new URAR form, a lot of those boxes and columns, those are all just condensing what's necessary in an appraisal report. I don't think you need all of that to get to the point. A lot of that stuff, again, it makes people feel more fees to justify. But in my experience, in a lot of commercial applications, you can pretty much get away with the approaches to value and with a restricted report and saying the rest of it's in your file. I've seen quite a bit of that. So I think
my
it's somewhere.
yeah, my intuition is to agree with you. And what I think happens a lot is that appraisers, when they're doing these reports for their clients, they're almost having to write them for the chief appraiser or the reviewer who works at the bank if they're doing lender work. You know what I mean? Because they send a report in, and if you send in, a short report that's slimmed down and like 20 or 30 pages long, if the chief appraiser, who's probably an MAI or whatever, who's working at that bank, or the reviewer who's like the gatekeeper that you have to go through, they're like, no, come on now, you need to give me more here. So I think a lot of times it's other appraisers who are working for lenders who are helping to perpetuate this. Listen, what I would say is this. So, I try to spend a lot of time interacting with investors. I have several friends who, invest and spend time with those folks. And These are people who are the market participants who actually have skin in the game, right? They're the ones actually putting their money on the line and making all these big investments. And when I ask them, okay, you're going to make an investment decision to put $8 million to work, whatever, or even more than that, right? Let me see your internal workup. How did you come about that? It doesn't look anything like 100 or 150 page commercial narrative appraisal report. It's much more to the point. And these are people who have more on the line than anybody else, because it's their money. They have skin in the game, and they're making those decisions in a much more slimmed down fashion, where they're only caring about what's important. None of this other, filler.
But that's so critical. And again, it gets back to technology. There was a time where this information wasn't readily available. Information from CoStar, Crexy, in any kind of informational source, especially from the institutional standpoint. You want to look at what's going on in the market and the market analysis, and you want to look at the macro and then how it translates down to the micro. So giving all that national macro information in the report, nobody cares at the end of the day, because like you said, an investor who's got skin in the game, he's already got that information. He's already got that data. And I think it just goes to, it's almost like a stifling of growth of when you actually got your designation. I can almost read reports and tell you about what year you started. And the older appraisers, they got 100, 200 pages, and 100, 90%, 75% of the pages are absolutely nothing. And if you're real writing, it doesn't take that long to tell the story. I like to I equate it to and you had a big box of Tide detergent. Well, now the box isn't that big. You just got the pods, and they're concentrated. The same thing with the data, the technology, and the reporting. So I think that's really important, and I think that needs to, when it takes you that long to convey what you're talking about, I think it's a sign that you don't know what you're talking about. You should be able to get to the point and be able to suss out what's relevant as opposed to what's not relevant, and hit it in an outline without a bunch of filler. I think the filler is just for fees, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you could be right. Like I said, I do think a lot of it is, sort of these gatekeepers working for. Now, I do, I still do some lender work. The majority of my practice is, litigation support and expert witness work. But, I do have, I have friends who do, almost primarily bank work. I have friends who work at banks as reviewers. I think what's driving a lot of this is my colleagues, a lot of them who I love very much, who are MAIs and working at banks. Some of them as the chief appraiser or the chief credit officer, whatever the role might be, who are sort of mandating this. Where if you were an appraiser on the panel and you tried to submit a report that was 20 or 30 pages long, they would fire it right back to you and like, yeah, right. And would demand that you give this 100. So, there's sort of this.
I would challenge him right back. Did you read the report? And where is it coming up short? So that's where you haven't even read it. And again, nobody's reading 100 pages. You're only going to read 30 at 100 pages anyway. So now why not just write the 30 that they're going to read and get to the point? And again, I think it gets back to fees. But also, I think there's an evolution that needs to take place, because the appraiser is no longer the appraiser and sort of monolithic. I believe the appraiser is more of an analyst and being able to tell the story, mitigate the risk, and somebody that you trust. So I think that gets back to the educational requirements and being able to learn and be comfortable with the model. I think a lot of it gets back to the training and lack of originality. And like you said, you got the gatekeepers that keep saying the same old thing, blah, 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 blah.
Yep. Well, maybe we won't figure it all out in this conversation, but I think
No,
we're
no, we won't get here, but it's an ongoing conversation, and I really applaud you and appreciate your postings because I find them hilarious. Especially, I mean, when you start in the morning. My favorite was when you were I think you were with a black guy, and you changed, and you did all this working out.
that
I think
guy's
you
hilarious.
had like 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was like, this guy is nuts, and I just find it rather enjoyable.
Yeah, that's so funny. That guy is hilarious on mine. He just keeps posting. He just posted this one video where he like put on this suit that I guess it stops it like so it's so like attack dogs can attack you but not hurt you. So I guess they use it for training dogs like German shepherds and whatever for police forces and for military. Like the trainers will put on these big suits so the dogs can just maul them but they won't get hurt. So he posted this video where he's like dipping his head in ice water like he did in that video that I posted, and then he puts on this suit, and he must have went to like a police training barracks or something. And then you just see like these three dogs like shepherds just attacking him, and he's like fighting them off, and he's crazy, man. It's so funny.
How do people respond to you continue to do it?
What's that?
How do people respond to your posts, and what makes
Uh,
you continue to post
oh
them?
yeah, I think a lot of it's just for my own humor. I think there's a lot of humor out there. This profession, it can be a little bit conservative and uptight, in my opinion. People take themselves very seriously, and I'm, and I do that with myself as well. So I'm guilty of that too. In terms of how people respond, listen, I'm sure there's people out there who don't think I'm really that funny at all. But then, there are people who appreciate it. There was one guy he's this appraiser up in Seattle, and I posted something just because I just thought it was funny. I'm just sitting there, so I posted it, and he called me just cracking up, and he's like, don't ever stop doing this. He's like, it's not getting old. He's like, I need this, to keep like laughing and everything. He's like, and I can't do it because this guy works at one of like the national firms. So there are people like that who think it's funny and like who get a chuckle. That I'm sure there's people out there like, this is old, this is stupid. I know. Listen, when Cindy Chance got fired by the Appraisal Institute, you should go back to my timeline then, because I was on fire with some of the memes that I was posting back then. Like I had like the Sopranos meme that people were just cracking up over. And one of the I'm
I
not
think
going
I
to say
remember that you had one. Was it Polly and Pussy that was in one that you
it
put?
was probably
Yeah,
on
I remember
the
that. Yeah.
he's like, listen, he's like, you don't have to worry about her talking about past leadership no more, and people were dying laughing. And I'll tell you, like, because of some of those posts around that time, there was somebody who you would just recognize it, somebody who's, known and I would say high profile in the appraisal community, who got really angry with me and just blocked me and doesn't want anything to do with me. So,
Well, it probably did you a favor.
yeah, maybe, listen, maybe I'm going overboard with it. Maybe it's something that I should
I,
stop.
I don't I don't I don't think so, and I don't want you to stop. But then people think I'm going overboard with the stuff I do and talk about. So
Yeah, we're
I
just
think it's
doing our best.
and it takes all of us, and it's really not that serious. And I just appreciate the fact that you're able to have fun and make it fun. I look forward to seeing your post. I look forward to your thought process. I look forward to your questions, and I think you exemplify what leadership should look like in the form of listening and being open into new ideas and doing that's what we've been doing for the last 500 years.
Well, I appreciate that, Thaddeus. And I feel the same way about you. I think you're out there asking the right questions, and I've seen your post recently about focusing on the reconsideration of value process. It is important because you can undercut and just chop off some of these issues that were happening. Just bring it to an end if you have a good ROV process where people can feel good about that they're being heard. So, I feel the same way about you. I just think our focus has to be on asking the right questions and thinking about more questions to ask, because
Well,
just trying to spout off like you have answers or just pontificating, that's not really going to do much for us.
and I think I'm glad you brought up the reconsideration of value, because it's something that's near and dear to me. And I had a conversation with somebody who I really respect, but we disagree about whether or not there is bias in appraising. And
Mhm.
I don't know if you want to call it bias or whatever you want to call it, but there's definitely a gap between black and brown property values and white property values. And so I will say that appraisal bias doesn't exist. It's disingenuous and misleading. There's definitely something that exists. We can agree to disagree about what we call it, but the difference is with the reconsideration of value. I think it goes a long way to establishing public trust, because as I travel the country, there are people that have story after story how they feel like they have been undervalued, and then when you present it to the appraising profession, they don't listen. Oh, it doesn't exist. They're just making it up. There is no look at the outdated systemic redlining. If you look at the highways that were breaking up the neighborhood, if you look at the disinvestment, if you look at reality in property taxes and how they impact services in the neighborhoods or lack thereof, I believe the reconsideration of value allows the public to be heard, but it's also fair for the appraisers. It's not accusing them of anything other than asking them how to explain their work objectively. And like you said, it can mitigate a whole lot of problems moving forward just up front.
Yeah, I agree with you. And listen, I certainly, I haven't thought about a lot of these issues as much as I'm sure that you have. But what I would say is, I know that it frustrates. I'm sure it must. I don't do a lot of this lender work, where you're getting these reconsideration of values, but I'm sure that's annoying for appraisers because you're already being like your fees have already been like hammered down on the residential end. So in order for you to run a profitable business, you can only spend so much time per report if you're doing primarily residential reports. So then when you're asked to do this long ROV, reconsideration of value, and like somebody gives you like 95 like potential comps that you have to review, I'm sure that can be frustrating, and it can be hard to do and work that into a profitable business. So there's a larger thing at work there, which I'm not really prepared to talk about. There's other people who are, when it comes to AMCs and things of that nature. So, but I agree with you. I mean, how many of these lawsuits could we have avoided if on the front end there was a thoughtful, ROV process? Maybe you could have nipped it in the bud there. Maybe, I don't know. But
I
to me,
believe
it seems
if you have subject matter experts, but it's something that appraisers need to do. Everybody is now expert on reconsideration of value, and they just don't have the substantive wherewithal to be at the questions with the market analysis, the questions with the comparable sales, the questions of how the adjustments. So I think if we make the process more robust and more thorough, we can go a long way to just because it doesn't make value. The reconsideration of value is not mean you're going to get a new value, but it
right.
does establish the trust. And I cannot tell you how many times that there's been no finding or nothing wrong, or there's been no case. And a lot of times it's about managing the expectation. Just recently, a couple of times where people said they had appraisals and they were just totally disgusted with their value. And I said, well, show me the appraisal and we can see what happened. Well, I don't. But what I did was I went to Zillow and I had a Zestimate. Then what are we talking about? So I think
Right.
some of it is emotional and being able to manage. But again, you need subject matter experts in the room in order to get that done. And then there is some gaslighting in the space when it comes to that. So I'm very aware and try to be cognizant of that and looking at it from all points of view.
That's great, man. I appreciate that. And, I hope you and I can, continue to stay in touch and collaborate and, bounce, ideas off of. The more voices we have in this profession, the better off we're going to be in the long run. That's for sure.
Well, absolutely. And I just want to thank you again for taking our time to come on to the 10K podcast. Those of you out there listening, please like and subscribe. And please get to Justin's LinkedIn to see his posts. They are hilarious. He will make you laugh before you get your day started or have you laughing during the middle of the day with some of the things that he's posting and the good work that he's doing out there and the exemplary leadership that he is showing in the space. So he's somebody that I follow and trust and like a lot of it in doing. So again, thank you so much for taking. I know we've been talking about trying to get this done for a while. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate you coming on to the podcast. And I look forward to getting up there too. Is it Del Frisco's or
Delco's Originals.
Delco's Originals? Okay, I'll be able to make sure we and what do you recommend at Delco's Originals?
Cheesesteak, man. That's where you go. Listen, any of their hoagies are good, but start with the cheesesteak, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, all right, Justin. Thanks again for coming on to the 10K podcast. Let's definitely stay in touch, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, my friend.
Take care.